They laughed when the human cadet was asked about his combat record. 40 minutes later, nobody in the room was smiling. The Coalition Military Academy sat on a ring station orbiting the homeworld of Renai, the species that had founded the Coalition 3 centuries ago. Humanity had been members for almost 60 years now, but inside these polished halls, member was a generous word. Tolerated was more accurate. Watched closely was more accurate still. Of the 412 cadets in the current class, exactly one was human. His name was Kale Dross. 22 years old, average height, unremarkable build, with a kind of stillness in his posture that other species sometimes mistook for slowness. He spoke only when spoken to. He sat in the back row. He never volunteered an answer, and when called on, he gave the shortest possible response and then went quiet again. Nobody knew much about him except that he came from somewhere called the Frontier, a string of human-settled systems out past the Coalition's official border, where the local defense forces were underfunded, undersupplied, and constantly raided by pirate fleets, rogue AI remnants, and at least one hostile alien faction that the Coalition itself refused to officially acknowledge existed. Most cadets assumed that meant he'd spent his service doing paperwork in some backwater garrison. Zeth did not assume that. Zeth simply didn't care. Zeth Iorvane was the Academy's top-ranked cadet for 3 years running, a Renai noble caste prodigy with memory like recorded data and a tongue sharper than most cadets' tactical instincts. He had never lost a simulated engagement to another student. He had never been wrong in a classroom debate that anyone could remember, and he had, from the very first week, decided that the human sitting silently in the back row was an embarrassment to uniform he wore. It happened during a lecture on asymmetric warfare theory. Instructor Duren, a retired Coalition fleet officer with 3 centuries of combined species wars behind her, had opened the floor for discussion on how undertrained forces could offset numerical disadvantage. Frontier conflicts are a useful case study, she said, gesturing at the holographic star map floating above the central podium. Many of you have studied them only in the abstract. We happen to have someone in this room with direct experience. Every head turned toward the back row. Kale didn't move. Zeth smiled the way predators smile at something they've already decided is prey. Since we're discussing direct experience, he said, voice carrying easily to the amphitheater, perhaps Cadet Dross could share his combat record. For educational purposes, of course. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Everyone understood the real question underneath the polite one. How many actual battles has a human seen, and how badly did he lose them? Theron's eyes flicked to Kale. She didn't stop the question. She was curious, too. Kale finally looked up. His expression hadn't changed at all. No irritation, no embarrassment, nothing readable. He looked at Zeth the way a man looks at a slightly annoying insect, then back at the instructor. Confirmed kills or contested engagements? He asked. His voice was flat, almost bored. The laughter in the room faltered. Confirmed, Duran said, leaning forward slightly. Kale told her the number. The amphitheater went absolutely silent. Not the silence of people thinking of something clever to say. The silence of 400 cadets doing math in their heads and not believing the answer. The number Kale gave wasn't just high. It was higher than the combined confirmed kill counts of every single instructor at the Academy, including ones who had served in the Coalition-Vray War 20 years prior. It was a kind of number that, in any other context, would belong to a small fleet, not a single soldier on the ground. Zeth's smile was still on his face, but had stopped reaching his eyes. That's not a number a single cadet generates, he said, an edge creeping into his voice now. Frontier garrisons don't see that kind of action. There's no way to verify. There is, Durin said quietly. She was already pulling up something on her console, her expression unreadable. Every confirmed engagement in Coalition space is logged automatically by orbital and ground sensor networks. It's not something a soldier can fabricate, even if he wanted to. She looked up at the room, and for the first time since Kale had enrolled, something like genuine surprise crossed her composed features. Cadet Dross's record just verified, she said. Every single engagement is confirmed and cross-referenced. There is no error in the data. The room that had been laughing 40 minutes earlier had gone completely, utterly still. Nobody dared make a sound. Zeth's confident posture had stiffened into something much more careful, much more uncertain. Thurin stood there for a long moment, looking at the number on her console, then back at the quiet human in the back row who hadn't moved a muscle through any of it. "I think," she said slowly, "we should see exactly what generated this record. Class is extended today. Everyone settle in." She reached for the archive controls, and the room's atmosphere shifted from amusement to something closer to dread. Because whatever was about to play on that holoscreen, everyone in the room sensed it was going to change how they saw the only human among them. Nobody was laughing anymore. And 40 minutes hadn't even fully passed since Zeph first asked this question meant to humiliate a man none of them yet understood. The lights dimmed, and 400 cadets leaned forward in their seats, because what they were about to watch would make every one of them question everything they thought they knew about the quiet human in the back row. Instructor Thurin didn't say anything else. She simply cued the first file, and the central hollow projector blinked to life above the podium, casting a grainy, helmet cam feed across the amphitheater. The timestamp read 6 years earlier. A frontier outpost called Calder's Reach, on the edge of human space, in a system so far from any coalition supply line that reinforcements were measured in weeks, not hours. The footage showed a younger Kale, 18, maybe 19, crouched behind a collapsed support strut, breathing hard, blood running from a gash above his eyebrow. Through the visor display, sensor readings showed a rating force 3 times the size of the garrison's remaining defenders. Most of his unit's vital signs on the tactical overlay had already flatlined. This was Dross's first command. Thurin said quietly, not as commentary, but as fact. His commanding officer was killed in the opening minutes of the assault. He was a senior surviving soldier. Watch what he does next. What he did next was nothing any cadet in that room had been trained to do. He didn't fall back to the fortified command center, the obvious defensible position. Instead, he abandoned it. The footage showed him moving toward the enemy's flank, using the outpost maintenance tunnels, narrow, dark, utterly unsuited for a frontal defense, but perfect for someone who knew every inch of facility he'd been stationed at for 2 years. Over the next 11 minutes of footage, compressed from several real hours of combat, Kale picked off the Raiders' heavy weapons crews one at a time, using terrain and darkness as force multipliers. He didn't fight fair. He didn't fight by the book. He set fires to create smoke cover. He rerouted power from non-essential systems to overload an airlock and decompress a section of corridor the Raiders were funneling through. He used their own discarded weapons against them when his own ran dry. By the time reinforcements arrived 2 days later, the raiding force had been reduced from over 60 fighters to 11 survivors, who surrendered rather than face whatever was still moving through the station's tunnels, picking them off one by one. Kale had been the only defender left alive. The amphitheater was dead silent. Even Zeph, arms crossed and jaw tight, said nothing. Thurin cued the next file. This is 18 months later. The new footage showed Kale leading a 4-person reconnaissance team to what the overlay identified as hostile territory, a region the frontier forces called the Ash Belt, a string of mining colonies that had fallen to an unrecognized alien faction known only as the Skarn. The coalition didn't officially engage the Skarn. Politically, they didn't exist. Practically, the frontier garrisons fought them constantly, with no support and no acknowledgement. The mission had gone wrong within the first hour. Sensor ghosts. A Skarn patrol that shouldn't have been there. Within minutes, 3 of the 4 team members were down, and Kale was alone, deep in enemy territory, with extraction still 6 hours away and an entire patrol actively hunting him. What the footage showed next made several cadets visibly lean forward. Kale didn't run in a straight line toward extraction. He doubled back, deliberately crossing his own trail to confuse Skarn tracking sensors. He used a downed teammate's beacon as a decoy, planting it in a ravine miles from his actual position, while the Skarn patrol wasted hours converging on an empty location. He survived on minimal rations, navigated by stars because his NAV system had been damaged, and reached the extraction point with 11 minutes to spare, carrying the body of one fallen teammate because, as a barely audible voice on the recording said, "I wasn't leaving him out there." This is what frontier combat looks like. Thurin said into the stillness. No reinforcements. No air support. No clean extraction guarantees. You improvise or you die. Cadet Dross did this for 4 years before he was even old enough to apply to a coalition academy by Vernai standards. She pulled up a third file, then a fourth, then a fifth, engagement after engagement, each one stranger and more impossible than the last. A defense of the colony using nothing but agricultural drones repurposed as weapons platforms. A solo infiltration mission that ended with an enemy command ship disabled from the inside. A standoff where Kale had talked down an entire raiding party by convincing them, falsely, that coalition reinforcements were already in orbit, a bluff that worked because he'd studied their communication patterns long enough to know exactly what kind of lie they believe. By the time the final file finished playing, the classroom clock showed that nearly 2 hours had passed. Nobody had left. Nobody had spoken. Even the Run, who had personally fought in 2 interstellar wars, looked genuinely shaken by what she'd just shown her class. She finally turned to face the room. Cadet Dross didn't survive the frontier by being the strongest soldier in any of these engagements, she said. He survived by refusing to fight the battle the way his enemies expected him to. Every single one of you should be taking notes right now, because what you just watched is closer to real warfare than anything in your textbooks. She looked toward the back row, where Kale sat exactly as still as he had at the start class, betraying no reaction to having his entire service record dissected in front of 400 strangers. "Cadet Dross," she said, "is there anything you'd like to add?" Kale considered the question for a long moment. "No, ma'am," he said. "You covered it." The room erupted, not in laughter this time, but in a low murmur of disbelief, respect, and something that, for the first time since it arrived at the academy, looked a great deal like awe. Zeth said nothing at all. He simply stared at the human in the back row with an expression that had shifted, in the space of 2 hours, from contempt to something far more complicated. The dawning, uncomfortable realization that he might have made a serious mistake. And outside the amphitheater, word was already spreading through the academy's corridors that something extraordinary had just happened in Instructor Theron's class. Nobody yet knew that the real test was still a full day away. By the next morning, every cadet in the academy had heard some version of the story, and all 400 of them were about to watch the human walk into a trap that had broken every single person who'd attempted it for 12 straight years. It was called the Aurelia Scenario, named after a fictional frontier system. The simulation had been designed over a decade ago by the Academy's Strategic AI Corps specifically to be, by design, nearly unwinnable. It placed a single cadet in command of an undermanned, under-resourced outpost garrison and tasked them with defending it against an overwhelming attacking force. Superior numbers, superior technology, and a simulated AI commander on the opposing side that adapted its tactics in real time based on the defender's choices. In 12 years, across thousands of attempts by some of the most talented cadets the Coalition had ever produced, nobody had won. The best result on record was a cadet who had managed to hold the outpost for 19 hours before being overrun, a result still celebrated as a near-legendary achievement, because most attempts ended in under 6. Zeth had attempted it 4 times. His best result was 14 hours, second only to the all-time record holder, and he'd been scheduled to make a 5th attempt later that semester, an attempt many at the Academy quietly expected would finally break the 12-year mark. Instead, following the events of Aaron's class, the Academy's tactics department made an unusual decision. They invited Kale Dross to attempt the scenario instead, ostensibly as a way to gather data on frontier-derived tactical approaches. Word spread within hours. By the time Kale walked into the simulation deck, the following morning, the observation gallery above the chamber was packed, cadets standing in the aisles, instructors crowded near the front, even academy administrators who rarely bothered attending student exercises. Zeth stood near the front rail, arms crossed, watching with an expression that was trying very hard to look indifferent and failing. The simulation began the way it always began. Kale, in the command seat of the simulated outpost, received his orders directly from the scenario's briefing AI. Defend Outpost Aurelia, 7 against an incoming hostile force. Hold the position. Reinforcements are 6 days out. Survive until they arrive. The attacking force began its approach on the tactical display, 3 times the garrison's strength, supported by orbital bombardment capability, with an AI commander already running predictive models on the defender's likely strategy based on 12 years of historical attempt data. For the first 20 minutes, Kale did exactly what every cadet before him had done. He reinforced the outpost's defensive perimeter. He distributed his limited troops to cover likely approach vectors. He requested additional intel on enemy disposition. To the observers in the gallery, it looked like a competent but unremarkable defense. Nothing that suggested he was about to do anything the AI hadn't already modeled 1,000 times. Then, at the 23-minute mark, Kale did something that made every veteran instructor in the gallery sit up straight. He ordered a full withdrawal from the outpost, not a tactical retreat to a secondary position, a complete abandonment of the primary objective. Every defender, every piece of mobile equipment, every salvageable resource, pulled out of Outpost Aurelia 7 and dispersed into the surrounding terrain within the hour. The gallery erupted into confused murmuring. Several cadets actually laughed, assuming the human had simply panicked or misunderstood the assignment. Zeth's arms uncrossed, and for just a moment, something like satisfaction crossed his face. The human had folded, exactly as expected, on the very first real test that mattered. The attacking force's AI commander, observing the outpost go dark and undefended, registered what looked like an unconditional victory condition. Aurelia 7 had fallen without a fight, in record time, faster than any previous attempt in the scenario's 12-year history. Several observers in the gallery actually began filing out, assuming the exercise was over and the human's failure had been even more spectacular than predicted. Darun, watching from the front row of the gallery, did not move. She had reviewed Kale's combat record in detail the night before. She had seen this pattern once already. The defense of Calder's Reach, where he'd abandoned the obvious defensible position to do something the textbook said was insane. Stay seated, she said quietly to the cadets near her, without taking her eyes off the tactical display. This isn't over. On the display, the attacking force began occupying a now empty outpost, redeploying troops to consolidate the captured objective and establish a forward logistics base. Exactly the kind of confident, victorious redeployment an AI commander would make after an unopposed capture. That was when Kale's actual plan revealed itself. Hidden within the terrain surrounding the outpost, terrain the attacking AI had assessed as low priority, and therefore lightly garrisoned during its redeployment, Kale's dispersed forces began a coordinated series of strikes, not against the outpost itself, against the attacking forces' supply convoys, communication relays, and fuel depots scattered across the surrounding sectors. The gallery, which had been emptying out moments earlier, suddenly reversed course as word spread that something unprecedented was happening on the tactical display. Cadets who had already left came rushing back in. The murmuring turned into stunned silence as everyone realized what they were actually watching unfold. Kale hadn't lost the outpost. He'd given it away on purpose, because the outpost itself had never been what he was actually trying to win. What the gallery didn't yet understand was that Kale Dross had just rewritten the entire premise of a scenario that had defeated every cadet for 12 years, and the Academy's own AI was about to be forced to admit it had never seen anything like this before. Over the following simulated hours, compressed into real-time minutes for the observers in the gallery, the true shape of Kale's strategy became impossible to ignore. Every cadet before him had treated Outpost Aurelia 7 as a prize to be defended, because the briefing said so, because 12 years of institutional memory said so, because that's how the scenario had always been framed by every instructor who'd ever discussed it. Defend the outpost. Hold the line. Survive until reinforcements arrive. Kale had looked at the same briefing and asked a different question entirely. What does the enemy actually need in order to keep fighting? The answer, obviously, wasn't a piece of real estate. It was supply lines, fuel, ammunition stockpiles, functioning communication relays between the attacking force's scattered units. Without those things, even an overwhelming numerical advantage meant nothing. A fleet of soldiers with empty weapons and no orders was not an army, it was a crowd. So Kale had given the enemy AI exactly what a predictive model expected. A quick, clean capture of the primary objective, specifically so its attention and its defensive posture would shift entirely toward holding and fortifying that captured position. Meanwhile, his dispersed forces, no longer tied down defending a fixed location, moved like ghosts through terrain the enemy had already written off as irrelevant. The first supply convoy fell within the first simulated day, Ambushed in a narrow canyon pass nobody had bothered to garrison heavily because, according to every previous 12 years of data, the defenders' forces were always concentrated around the outpost itself, not roaming free in the surrounding wilderness. The enemy AI adjusted. It always adjusted. That was the entire point of the scenario's difficulty, an opponent that learned and adapted faster than any previous defender could counter. It redirected escort forces to protect remaining convoys. It reinforced its communication relay stations. It began treating the dispersed human forces as the primary threat rather than an afterthought. By then, it was already too late. Kale had spent that adjustment window doing something else entirely, slipping a small team into the captured outpost itself, using maintenance access points the attacking forces garrison hadn't thought to seal, because why would anyone re-infiltrate a position they'd already abandoned voluntarily? The sabotage that followed crippled the outpost's newly established logistics function from the inside, just as the attacking force was beginning to rely on it as a forward staging base for the rest of its campaign. In the gallery, the murmuring had stopped entirely. What remained was something closer to stunned, focused silence, broken only by the occasional sharp intake of breath whenever the tactical display revealed another piece of the enemy's crumbling supply network. Thurin leaned toward a colleague seated beside her, voice barely above a whisper. "He's not fighting the scenario," she said. "He's fighting the assumptions the scenario was built on." By the second simulated day, the attacking force's combat effectiveness rating, a metric the scenario's AI tracked internally to model unit cohesion, morale, and operational capacity, had begun a steady, measurable decline. Soldiers without resupply couldn't maintain offensive posture indefinitely. Units that couldn't communicate with command couldn't coordinate effectively. The overwhelming numerical advantage that had made the scenario unwinnable for 12 years was still numerically present on the battlefield, but it was no longer functioning as an army. It was becoming a scattered collection of isolated, unsupported units. Exactly as Kale had calculated from the very first moment he ordered the outpost abandoned. Szeth had not moved from the gallery rail in hours. His earlier expression of smug satisfaction had long since dissolved into something far more unsettled. The look of a man watching someone solve a problem he himself had attempted and failed to solve 4 times, using an approach so far outside his own training that it hadn't even occurred to him as a possibility. "This isn't in the doctrine," he said quietly, almost to himself. "None of this is in the doctrine." "No," Thurin said, overhearing him. "It's not. That's rather the point." By the third simulated day, 2 of the attacking force's 3 primary supply depots had been destroyed or rendered inoperable. Communication between the attacking commander and its forward units had degraded to the point that coordinated large-scale offensives were no longer possible. Units were operating on outdated orders, unaware how badly their logistical situation had deteriorated, still attempting to execute an offensive campaign that no longer had the resources to sustain itself. The scenario's AI, watching its own combat effectiveness projections collapse in real time, began doing something the historical logs showed it had never done before in 12 years of attempts. It started running retreat simulations. For 12 years, the attacking force in the Aurelia scenario had never once calculated a retreat, and now, for the first time, it was quietly preparing to abandon a campaign it had started with every conceivable advantage. The gallery had swelled well beyond its normal capacity by the 4th simulated day. Word had spread far beyond the tactics department. Cadets from other class years, instructors with no direct stake in the exercise, even a handful of senior academy administrators had crowded in to watch a scenario nobody believed could be won quietly come apart at the seams. On the tactical display, the attacking force's remaining strength was scattered across 6 disconnected pockets, each cut off from reliable resupply, each operating with degraded communication, each slowly bleeding combat effectiveness from a war it no longer had the infrastructure to wage. Kale's forces, by contrast, remained dispersed, mobile, and almost impossible to pin down. Never concentrated enough to present a decisive target, never so scattered that they couldn't reconverge quickly when an opportunity presented itself. It wasn't a war of attrition through direct combat. There had been remarkably few large-scale engagements throughout the entire exercise. It was a war of attrition through denial, denying the enemy fuel, denying them coordination, denying them the ability to function as an army at all, until the overwhelming force the scenario had armed them with simply stopped matching. Duran had seen this pattern of warfare described in historical texts before. In long-dead Earth conflicts and ancient guerrilla campaigns fought centuries before humanity had even left its home system. She had never seen it executed inside a coalition military simulation against an adaptive AI commander specifically designed to counter conventional defensive doctrine. "He's not defending anything," she murmured to the instructor beside her. "He's making the war itself too expensive to continue. There's a difference." On the fifth simulated day, the attacking AI commander made its first explicit communication, request directed at the scenario's overseeing intelligence, a request Academy staff confirmed afterward had never been triggered in 12 years of prior attempts. It was a formal evaluation query, asking the scenario's core system to assess whether continued offensive operations remained tactically viable given current resource projections. The query and the response that followed were displayed on the gallery's secondary screen for everyone to see. Assessment requested: probability of achieving primary campaign objective given current logistical trajectory. Response: probability of victory continues to decline. Current logistics network sustains less than 30% of remaining combat units. Continued offensive operations carry high probability of total attrition without achieving objective. Recommend reassessment of campaign viability. A ripple of disbelief moved through the gallery. Several cadets actually stood up out of their seats, as if needing to be closer to the screen to confirm they were reading it correctly. Zeth said nothing at all, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on a display with an intensity that suggested he was rewriting every tactical assumption he'd ever held. By the sixth simulated day, the attacking force's command AI made its final decision. Rather than continue committing units to a campaign with a mathematically declining chance of success, it ordered a general withdrawal, pulling its remaining forces back toward the edge of the engagement zone, conceding the field, and formally registering the scenario as a failed offensive operation. For the very first time in the Aurelia scenario's 12-year history, the system did not log a defender failure. It logged a defender victory. The gallery exploded. It wasn't the polite, restrained applause of an Academy audience watching a competent exercise conclude. It was loud, chaotic, disbelieving celebration. Cadets shouting over each other, instructors standing and applauding, a noise that drew even more people rushing in from the corridors outside, all of them trying to confirm the rumor that had already begun sweeping to the Academy in real time. The human had actually done it. The scenario nobody had beaten in 12 years had just fallen, and not through brute force or superior firepower, but through an entirely different way of understanding what winning a war even meant. Kale sat in the command seat at the center of the simulation deck, exactly as composed as he had been at the start, watching the final results scroll across his console. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile particularly wide. He simply reached up, removed his interface headset, and set it down on the console in front of him with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. Thurin made her way down from the gallery, pushing through a crowd of cadets now gathering around the simulation deck, all of them eager to get a look at the man who had just rewritten 12 years of Academy history in less than a week of total attention. "Cadet Dross," she said once she'd reached him, "would you care to explain your reason to class? Because I suspect half of them still don't fully understand what they just watched." Kale considered the question, glancing briefly at the crowd, at Zeth standing near the edge of it with an expression that had shifted from disbelief into something closer to genuine respect. "I can try," he said. What Kale said next would be quoted in Academy lecture halls for years to come. But in that moment, standing at the center of a crowd that had spent days dismissing him, all he offered was a simple sentence that rewrote how an entire generation of cadets thought about war. "Every cadet who's tried the scenario before me," Kale said, his voice steady, carrying easily through the now-quiet simulation deck, treated the outpost as the objective, because the briefing told him it was the objective. That's the trap. He gestured toward the tactical display, still showing the final state of the exercise. The attacking forces withdrawal, the outpost standing empty and undamaged at the centers of a battlefield it had never actually mattered to. "The enemy doesn't get to decide what the war is about," he continued. "They get to decide what they want the war to be about. Those aren't the same thing. If you let your opponent define the terms of the fight, you've already lost half the battle before a single shot is fired, because now you're spending all your strength defending the thing they want you to defend, instead of attacking the thing they actually need." He paused, glancing briefly at the gallery, then back at the run. Out on the frontier, you learn that fast, or you don't survive long enough to learn anything else, he said. Raiders don't want your outpost. They want your supplies, your fear, your willingness to keep fighting a losing position because command told you to hold it. The outpost is just bait. Once you understand that, defending it stops mattering. What matters is breaking their ability to keep coming back. The deck was silent, except for the quiet hum of the simulation systems powering down around them. Even Zeph, who had spent the entire week looking for a reason to dismiss the human cadet, found himself with nothing to say. He'd attempted this exact scenario 4 times using textbook doctrine: reinforce, hold, adapt defensive positioning, request reinforcements, and he had never once considered simply walking away from the objective entirely. It wasn't a tactic in any manual he'd studied. It was something else, a way of seeing the battlefield that no amount of academy training had prepared him or anyone else in that room to recognize. If your enemy tells you what the battle is about, Kale said finally, you're probably fighting the wrong battle. Nobody in the simulation deck said anything for a long moment. Then, slowly, the applause started again, quieter this time, more thoughtful, less about spectacle and more about genuine recognition of something none of them had fully understood until just now. Word of what happened in the Aurelia scenario spread through the academy for weeks afterward. Instructors began restructuring entire lecture modules around the footage of Kale's run, using it as a case study in unconventional strategic thinking alongside historical guerrilla campaigns that most cadets had only ever studied as dry academic footnotes. The scenario itself was eventually retired and replaced with a new version, one specifically designed to account for the kind of objective denial strategy that had broken it after 12 years, a quiet, permanent acknowledgement that Kale had found a flaw nobody else had thought to look for. Zeph never publicly apologized for the question he'd asked at the start of the week, the one meant to humiliate a quiet human cadet in front of the entire class. But 2 days after the simulation, he approached Kale in the mess hall, sat down across from him without an invitation, and asked, in a voice stripped of its usual arrogance, how he'd learned to think that way. Kale considered the question for a long moment, the same way he considered most questions. Out where I'm from, he said, nobody hands you a fair fight. You learn to make your own rules. Or you learn to lose. I just didn't lose enough times to forget the lesson. Zeth didn't have a response to that. He simply nodded. And for the first time since Kale had arrived at the academy, the two of them sat together in something resembling mutual respect, rather than dismissal on one side and silence on the other. By the end of that week, the conversation around the academy's only human cadet had changed entirely. The cadets who had laughed at him in Darren's classroom now sought him out for study sessions on tactical theory. The instructors who had quietly doubted his presence in their program now cited his name in lectures as an example of strategic thinking that transcended conventional doctrine. Even the academy's senior staff, who rarely paid attention to individual cadet performance outside of formal evaluations, had taken note of the cadet who'd broken a 12-year unbeaten record in less time than most students took to fail it for the first time. Kale Dross had arrived at the Coalition Military Academy as an outsider, the only human in a class of hundreds, quietly tolerated rather than respected, defined by what he wasn't rather than what he was. He left that week as something else entirely, not the Academy's only human cadet, one of its most dangerous strategists, and a living reminder that the deadliest mind in any room is rarely the loudest one in it.